Hello all, Rick here, and in this video I aim to look at just how the construction of Starfleet's ships is accomplished and all the work involved. In order to build a Starship, you're going to need the raw materials, and in an age of replicators, a surprising amount of things are still mined and hauled around rather than synthesized out of nothing or recombined from something else. This is in part down to some construction materials such as polyduranide and dilithium, which are either incredibly difficult to replicate or just downright impossible. Because of this, there is still a major reliance on mining and trade among both Federation colonies and other worlds. The UFP maintains several colony planets which are primarily dedicated to the mining and procurement of materials which are generally populated by a workforce and their families. One of the first such established settlements was on Luna, but soon expanded to worlds such as Janus 6 and Corvan, as well as across numerous asteroids. In these locations, operations were conducted to excavate ores from deep within a planet, although seldom by hand. Much of the actual drilling was done with guided seismic lasers that would burrow down, while tractor beams would funnel up the material to be processed. Most Federation miners' time was only spent underground to regulate the equipment and engage in manual labour pretty much only in areas where it was not possible to use their advanced technology. One of the most sought after mines were those that provided dilithium, as this material cannot be replicated even by the 32nd century, and it is at the heart of most warp reactors, including the Federation's. Dilithium mines were the most likely to exist in worlds beyond the Federation members, as Starfleet was always willing to engage in trade with other powers for more dilithium. One of the most well-known mines is the Klingon world of Rura Penthe, which utilises its convict population to manually extract the resource and export it to other buyers, as well as their own fleet. Shipments are then ferried back to Federation facilities via their own cargo transports, a convenient Starfleet vessel, or an independent freighter captain. For materials that can be created via replication, well, the only mitigating factor is the power requirements of industrial replicators, and the UFP can forego searching for resources unless it is more efficient to do so. When a ship is going to be built, it is generally done so as part of a line of newer vessels. For example, several Galaxy-class ships will be built at the same time, even if their completions are staggered. There are some exceptions, of course, the most notable being prototype vessels that are the pioneering design or technology, or maybe some emergency build. Otherwise, it is just not resource efficient to simply build a single ship. To this end, the appropriate shipyard is picked as the locale for this line, either a dry dock facility that will ship in the components, or a full-on construction yard like Utopia Planitia that is capable of creating components before beaming them up to the orbital facilities. A Starship is constructed primarily of metallic, plastic, other composites and alloys that make up the skeletal frame and the hull of the ship. The most commonly used material since the beginning of Starfleet ship design is the alloy duranium, but also in use are dentarium, titanium, transparent aluminum, as well as various polycomposites and rhodium. Victorium was useful in the construction of superstructures and much larger builds, but the Federation tried to limit its use as it messes with transporter systems, disrupting the beaming process. The frame is the first thing that is constructed, providing the layout and stability for further building, and generally assembled in orbit within the confines of a dry dock. We see the Kelvin Universe Enterprise being constructed on Earth at a ground facility in Riverside, Iowa, but that looks cool but makes little sense unless they were there to install something specific. However, I guess it would not be that difficult to hoist it back into orbit with the power of tractor beams, inertial dampeners, and impulse engines. Once the frame is completed, the internals are built out with corridors, chambers, and rooms, while at the same time the hull is prepared. Most of this is accomplished through the use of small worker bee ships with manipulative arms, drones, or simply by hand with an EVA crew of shipwrights. During this stage 2, you are going to want to install components that will be impossible to remove before you attach the hull plating, rendering those areas inaccessible. Hull plating is applied in layers and segments with a layer for insulation against heat, radiation and other cosmic effects, then a durable outer layer of duranium plating for protection. Because the hull of a starship is applied piece by piece in manageable chunks, it leads to a pattern known as Aztecing, where you can see the pattern of joints and seams between the hull plating. This can be covered by another coating to provide a more matte finish, and different materials are also used in different locations, depending on the needs of the vessel. For example, the areas around impulse engine outlets are going to be far more heavily shielded for heat resistance, while the nacelles receive special treatment too. Layers of osmium are applied to the nacelles for insulation, and polysilicate verterium and monocrystal cortenium are combined to make vertinium cortinide, which serves a similar purpose. There are going to be a lot of made-up substances. While the ship is being built in the dry dock, many of the components that will be its systems are being assembled in factories like those on the surface of Utopia Planitia, or space stations. This is a job that is done both by machines on a line and, frequently, by hand. For example, in Apocrypha, sensor systems have to be finely calibrated, and much of that work is still done by a person. These are assembled planet-side and shipped to the construction sites in orbit before being installed. Many of these systems require special components and compounds such as shield generators requiring mercasium. The fact that much of this was done by hand was used to explain the need for the A500 synths, based on the Soong Maddox research, although these machines were not self-aware but had the humanoid form required, being dexterous enough to create these components. Just as with the raw materials required, some of these systems were imported to the shipyard from external sites or factories dedicated to the manufacturing of specialised parts. Once the warp core was installed, the ship could theoretically be powered up before it was even fully completed, although numerous checks and safety benchmarks would have to be met along every step of the way. Eventually areas of the ship would be sealed and pressurised, allowing for work crews to step into those zones and work more freely, installing the extensive circuitry all throughout the ship. By this stage the ship was looking far closer to completion, and often fully operating off of its own power supply, with its own internal computer core, active and monitoring systems. One strange thing that we see in Star Trek, quite often in fact, is the appointment of a starship's captain before the vessels are even completed, and their first task is generally to oversee the assembly of their craft. Erica Hernandez with the Columbia, Benjamin Sisko with the Defiant, and Robert April for the Enterprise, to name a few. When the internal systems were fully installed, the hull was completed and any further components required were small enough to be beamed in or shuttled across. The ship was then given its heraldry, which varied depending on the class and era. All Starfleet ships bore the organisation's insignia, and more often than not some stripe or decal in Starfleet's colours. At this stage the name was applied across the saucer section, and sometimes in other locations too, with the registry in a similar place and often reiterated across multiple points of the hull, generally the nacelles and sides. Then comes the weeks of systems diagnostics and tests where errors are ironed out, faults repaired, and the inevitable breakages replaced. Once this arduous but necessary process is completed, the last step is to test if the ship is spaceworthy, and that's done by flying it. A shakedown cruise is often the ship's first voyage, as an operational craft designed to reveal any lingering issues in a controlled fashion. And while some ships do fly before their shakedown, it is still considered a grand affair and preceded with the ceremonial ship launch. In a tradition as old as shipcraft, the vessel is officially named and a bottle of wine is shattered across its hull, signalling the completion of the project. For this, the entire crew is present, as well as those who played a part in its construction, and usually members of the Admiralty, press and other VIPs. While this signals the finalisation of the ship's construction, there will often be outlying issues and problems that the crew will have to contend with and address over time, with official fixes or workarounds. perhaps even developing their own efficient methods that eventually become Starfleet standard. It is these quirks that mean that even when a vessel is of the same class as one of its sister ships, each is an individual in its own right that the crew develops a feel for, something any engineer, captain or pilot will confirm. So, from material acquisition to the naming of vessels and its first run, that is the process of constructing a Federation starship. Thank you for watching, and until next video, I've been Rick, and I'll see you again later. Goodbye.